Senator,
consider. Let me answer my question.
I am
a limited
answering your
amount of
question.
time, Ambassador. If I ask you to be specific and answer my question. Comments about working towards a bill that all of America can take pride in and participate. No, it's not going to access.
Congress has the power, the right, and the obligation to make sure we spend the taxpayers' money wisely.
Hello, I'm Bob Menendez, and welcome to another Report to the People. On today's show, we will be talking about recent developments in Afghanistan and the importance of moving from a counterinsurgency strategy to one of counterterrorism. Our guest today is one of the most influential foreign policy experts in America, Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. But before I introduce him, let me restate what I said at a recent Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing on our Afghanistan policy. The events of September 11th clearly justified our intervention in Afghanistan, but it seems to me we have largely met our goals. Al-Qaeda is down to 50 to 100 fighters. We killed bin Laden, and through drone strikes and other covert operations in Pakistan, we have crippled Al-Qaeda's network in the region, leaving its leaders either dead or pinned down. Of 30 top Al-Qaeda leaders identified by American intelligence, 20 have been killed in the last year and a half. We have significantly drained the swamp. And our task now is not nation building, but ensuring the swamp does not fill again. We have limited the influence and reach of the Taliban. We may never be able to completely dismantle the Taliban, but we have greatly weakened its control. And through continued civilian assistance, we can continue to strengthen the Afghan government so that it provides services to its citizens, harness the power of its natural resources, estimated at more than $1 trillion, and diminish the role of the Taliban. At a time that we are scrutinizing every federal dollar, we're spending an incredible $10 billion a month in Afghanistan, $10 billion which could go to deficit reduction or creating jobs for people here in New Jersey. The time has come to allow Afghans to draw on our nearly $40 billion investment in a 290,000 strong Afghan National Security Force and allow them the opportunity to defend their nation and their people. I believe it's time to reform our mission, to target our military resources and do what we should do in the region to fight the real threats we face. I'm sure my guest will have a strong opinion on all of these issues. Let me introduce you to him. He is Dr. Richard Haass. He is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations since 2003. He is the author of 11 books on American foreign policy, including War of Necessity, War of Choice, a memoir of 2 Iraq wars. He was director of policy and planning for the Department of State and a principal advisor to former Secretary of State Colin Powell. And he has been vice president and director of foreign policy studies at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. Dr. Haass, it's a pleasure to have you with us. I know this program is going to make you even more famous than you are at the end of the day, but I couldn't think of a better voice to have here to share with our viewers some of these issues. So let's start off with, from your perspective, what should be our Afghanistan policy?
It ought to be a lot more modest than it is. I'm not favoring withdrawal, just to be clear, but I do want to favor a dramatic drawdown. Right now, we have 100,000 troops. The president's talked about going down, as you know, to roughly 70,000 troops over the next 15 months. I'd actually go down to something like 25,000 troops, or even slightly less than that over that same amount of time. So a much more accelerated drawdown. And what I would do is limit our role. I would limit our role to advising, training, and doing the sort of thing in Afghanistan we successfully just did in Pakistan, i.e. counterterrorism missions, surgical sort of efforts like that, using drones or American special forces. But I would limit it to that. I would stop our war fighting there. I don't think the United States has to fight every last Taliban. I agree with you, at the risk of imperiling your political future, but I think we essentially have largely succeeded. Al-Qaeda is no longer using Afghanistan anything like the way they were before 9/11. They're not using Afghanistan in a particularly unique way. There's nothing special now about Afghanistan, for example, as opposed to Yemen or Somalia or any number of other places. So we really ought to dramatically limit what we do there. It's not that significant. It's not really worth it. And whether we use the money for other military purposes or domestic purposes or fiscal improvement, that's a matter for, if you will, day-to-day political debate. But we need to get strategic here. And the problem is we are doing far more in Afghanistan than our national security warrants or than our economic security really allows.
Well, I want to explore some of those things with you. You know, the opponents of your view and mine would say, well, what you're going to do is allow Afghanistan to once again be a place in which activities can take place by al-Qaeda. You'll strengthen the Taliban. They will provide a safe haven for al-Qaeda. What do you say to those views?
Two things. One, I'm not sure they're right. The Taliban may have learned their lesson. They allowed al-Qaeda to use their country freely. When they ran the country of Afghanistan before 9/11, they paid a price. They were ousted by the United States together with other Afghans right after 9/11. So it's not clear to me most Taliban, even if they got a chance to once again play a large role in their country, would invite in these foreigners, because that's what al-Qaeda is. But if I'm wrong, and they were to make the same mistake again, then we go kill them. And that we use drones, we use American Special Forces, and by the way, we've built up several 100,000 Afghan soldiers, be it at the national level or at the local level, and they can take the fight to them as well. So they're not going to have free reign in the country, even if they get the chance.
Now, one of the observations I've made with 290,000 Afghan security forces, for which we have spent anywhere between $35 and $40 billion to be able to train and strengthen, compared to the number of even Taliban fighters that are estimated to exist, it'd be a 14-to-1 ratio.
Yeah, it seems to me a large investment. It also fights in some ways Afghan culture and history. What we're trying to do is build up these large national organizations in a country which is really quite diffused or decentralized. So I'm skeptical of this. I'm not against building up the national forces, but I'm skeptical. We certainly ought not to put all of our eggs in that basket. We ought to be building up local forces as well. And we started some of that, though I would shift the emphasis. But basically, we ought to continue training, continue advising, but turn down the spigot. It's not worth it. And let's not also forget that what matters is not just Afghanistan, but it's Pakistan. It's Pakistan, the country that's hosting the world's most dangerous terrorist. It's Pakistan that provides sanctuary to the Taliban we're so worried about. It's Pakistan that has the fastest growing nuclear arsenal in the world. So we ought to be thinking much more about what we might do to limit the threat or the problems emanating from Afghanistan's neighbor. But Afghanistan itself is one piece on a global chessboard, and quite honestly, it's not all that significant a chunk of real estate. The idea that the United States is now spending over $2 billion a week there. The idea that we're spending something like 1 out of every 6 or 7 defense dollars on Afghanistan, does anyone seriously think that the future of the 21st century is going to be determined by what happens on the plains of Afghanistan? It really seems to me to reflect a true absence of strategic thinking.
And that's a point I want to take off from, because if we had not had the role that we've had in Afghanistan post-September 11th, and it was an engagement that I originally supported. That's where bin Laden was at the time. It's where al-Qaeda was at the time. They were the perpetrators of September 11th, people who killed 3,000 American citizens, 700 from my home state of New Jersey. Fully supported President Bush in that respect. Of course, then we went to Iraq, we deviated our attention, and that created a whole set of circumstances. But if we were starting today, looking at, you know, the strategic interests of the United States, the national interest, the national security interests of the United States, and we were to say, does Afghanistan merit 100,000 soldiers? Does it merit, you know, $10 billion a month? Does it merit all of the diplomatic and civilian assistance in the context of looking at the world? If you were sitting in the State Department once again, you'd say?
Absolutely not.
All right.
No, and like you, I think what we did after 9/11 was exactly right. Afghanistan at that point was a major threat to the United States. It was allowing its real estate to be used by dangerous terrorists who killed thousands of Americans, and for all we know, might have tried to kill thousands more. So we were right to go in there, to oust the Taliban government, to get rid of al-Qaeda, to force them out of the country, to kill as many as we could. That was all exactly right. What happened, though, over the last several years is the mission evolved. And it evolved from a counterterrorism approach that I think had largely succeeded, and into what some people call counterinsurgency, others called nation building, but essentially we got much more ambitious. And we were going to stand up Afghanistan, its army, its police, its government, so it could basically become self-sufficient. And that simply seems to me a bridge too far. I don't think it's going to work. But even if it were to work, it's not worth it. Again, in foreign policy, sometimes you've got to decide what your priorities are. And when I look at the full menu of possibilities out there, I think this long shot called developing this modern country of Afghanistan is just that. It's a long shot that doesn't warrant the attention it's getting.
I want to talk about some of the broader issues that jump off from Afghanistan in a minute. But when I think about the follow-on here, so we're both of the view of that this should be significantly reduced,
Sure.
have a counterterrorism effort, because in essence a counterinsurgency effort is we're fighting, in essence, the Taliban to help the Karzai government be able to, stand up for itself, govern itself, and ultimately defend itself. And even that is a questionable issue for me in terms of the nature of the Karzai government and the essence of corruption there and their willingness. But what role, in addition to reducing the size and moving to a counterterrorism effort, which means we're not focused necessarily on the Taliban, we're focused on the #1 threat to the United States, which is Al-Qaeda. What is there a continuing civilian role that we should be playing here? Is there a continuing development assistance role? What do we say to the Afghans who have, from a whole bunch of reports, nearly $1 trillion in natural resources, including lithium, among other precious minerals? What do we say to them about ultimately moving in a direction that helps them stand themselves up?
I think there is a continuing development role. Until, though, there's conditions of stability and order, you're not going to be able to develop any of these minerals on a large scale. So I think also the United States has something of an obligation. We shouldn't just walk away from places where we've invested in and we've made commitments to. So I think we can continue to try to help the government become more modern, help the economy get going, build up the capacities, if you will, of a limited modern state. We should do all that, but that doesn't require billions of dollars a week. They can't absorb that kind of money. We can't spend that kind of money there in a useful way. So again, we scale down what we do. Too many people are caricaturing the debate as if the only two choices are between what it is we're doing, which is enormous and ambitious, and doing nothing, withdrawing, walking away. That's not the real debate. The real debate is in between. There is a gray area here, and the answer is we ought to be dialing down what we're doing, but continue. Exactly what you're saying. Build up some of these functions, because one of the big problems in our policy is you've got a corrupt, incompetent Afghan government. One of the things we should have learned from other issues or experiences like this in Vietnam and elsewhere is you've got to have a partner that is a partner. And the problem is Afghanistan is not much of a partner. They're losing the hearts and minds of their own people because they're not delivering the basic services of government. All this economic corruption and the rest is alienating Afghans. Then on top of it, you have the external problem, which is their neighbor is providing a sanctuary to the people who are challenging the development of order in the country. And the combination of the two, the absence of a partner at home with the Karzai government and the absence of a partner next door in Pakistan, means this policy, I think, is pretty much doomed to fail.
So as we advocate for a transition here to a counterterrorism approach, why don't we explain to our viewers a little bit exactly what that means? And this would bring in Pakistan in our conversation.
Sure. Counterterrorism in the lingo is just that. It's going after the terrorists. It's going after them directly, individual terrorists or units, or it's going after those who support them, who provide them sanctuary. So in the case of Afghanistan, it might mean attacking any terrorists we can uncover through intelligence. And we can attack them with drones, we can put the Afghan forces on them, we can use American special forces, like again we did with the bin Laden raid in Pakistan. You also try to, quote unquote, dry the swamp, try to do away with the conditions that breed terrorism. We try to get people to think twice about giving them support. We try to make governments realize it's a bad policy choice to give them support. And that's where you get to Pakistan. That's the biggest provider of sanctuary to the terrorists. It's the biggest provider of sanctuary to various Taliban groups. And what we tried to do, either through inducements, various amounts of economic and military aid, or penalties, we've tried to get the Pakistanis over the years to move away, to distance themselves from the terrorists, and we failed. And they failed because they see the terrorists as tools. They use the terrorists to try to influence the situation in Afghanistan. They use the terrorists in order to, every once in a while, stick a finger at India, which is Pakistan's basic rival. So the real problem here is the United States and Pakistan, though we call each other friends and partners and all that kind of diplomatic stuff, the reality is the United States and Pakistan are not on the same page.
So, I've been one of those critics who have questioned seriously whether the dollars that we have had flowing into Pakistan in coalition support funds and a whole host of other elements have produced the dividends that we think they should. I've, seriously questioned that they have. And certainly, the capture and killing of bin Laden, hard to believe that at some level in the Pakistani government there was not some knowledge that there was a high-value target, if not bin Laden himself. The follow-on of how the Pakistanis have acted since the capture and killing of bin Laden have raised serious questions about their commitment. And yet, this is a very important part of our puzzle in terms of how we deal with counterterrorism. So what would you envision us doing beyond what we have done already? How do we get the Pakistanis to think differently, act differently, pursue the terrorists? It's a challenging issue because they seem to, as you say, be invested in using the very essence of those terrorists to promote what they think are their interests.
And the honest answer is I'm not sure we can get them to change their ways. Successive American administrations have tried, and we've failed one way or another, no matter whether we used honey or vinegar. Nothing seems to quite work, and it may be at the end of the day we can't. That is simply that the Pakistani national security strategy is inconsistent with our own, that they ultimately will embrace terrorists for what they see as their national or vital national interests. I disagree with them, but I'm not sure we can, but at least it's worth trying. And I also, by the way, agree with you that a lot of the aid we've given, we haven't really gotten much in the way of return on. So I would be willing to give the Pakistanis aid, even considerably more aid than we have given them, but only under the strictest conditionality, that essentially any amount of American generosity would be met completely by conditionality on exactly how this money is to be used, whether for civilian purposes, economic purposes, military purposes, what have you, and we would have to monitor it real closely. No blank checks, no big deposits in accounts on the hopes that things actually down the road work out. Very, very strict monitoring. Now my hunch is the Pakistanis would not accept these conditions. If that's the case, okay. Then we essentially cooperate with them in limited areas where we can, and we act independently when we have to. And the bin Laden raid, to me, was a model. We acted independently. We didn't tell them because we didn't trust, quite rightly, that if we told them they wouldn't tip off the bad guys. So I think we could very well face a strained future with Pakistan. It's arguably the most difficult bilateral relationship we've had. Could well be the most difficult we're going to have. This is a country, as you know, what, 180 million people. The demographics are growing very quickly. The nuclear stockpile is growing very quickly. They've got all these terrorists. They're in many ways interfering with our aims in Afghanistan. This is a significant problem for us. But at the risk of sounding un-American, this may be a problem for which there's no solution. And when that's the case, you simply try to manage the consequences. You do as best you can in trying to contain the problem. But I'm quite pessimistic about whether we will be able to, one way or another, through incentives or penalties, get the Pakistanis to act as a responsible country. After decades and decades of trying, I'm afraid I'm skeptical, but I'm willing to take another run at it. Mm-hmm. But again, only under the strictest sorts of conditions.
Well, I've always called for benchmarks as a guide, conditionality benchmarks. And as a matter of fact, recently Secretary of State Clinton was before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I pressed her on this issue, and I have seen subsequently that the administration has actually frozen any more monies going to Pakistan, which I applaud. The Pakistanis have responded by saying, well, maybe they'll withdraw their troops from the border where, we have wanted them to pursue Al-Qaeda and other terrorist networks, that their cooperation would even be lessened. The whole question of those who say, well, we have a challenge here because our road into Afghanistan for supply routes goes to Pakistan to a large degree, and if that is challenged, it becomes more difficult.
I interrupt you there, but that's
how do we respond to some of those?
Well, the last point is true. Probably half or so of the amount of material we move into Afghanistan goes through Pakistan. That, to me, is yet another reason to draw down what we're doing in Afghanistan. We want to become less dependent on the Pakistanis. That gives them less leverage to use against us. No, but everything you said is truth. One of the things we've learned in this part of the world is things can get worse, as bad as they are. And that's why I wouldn't give up on the Pakistan relationship. I don't think it's a switch. Again, I want to avoid an all or nothing because we're never going to get all.
Right.
But we don't necessarily want to, we clearly don't want to go to nothing. So where we can have pockets of cooperation, we can. But again, it's got to be, your word benchmarks, my word conditionality, it's the same idea. It's got to be very critical and it's got to be very specific, and we'll help them so long as we know that the help is going to the intended purpose. And I think we have to accept it again, that in important areas, they are not going to do what it is we want, and we have to think about how is it we protect ourselves, whether with counterterrorism missions or we bring in other countries in the region to help us stabilize things in Afghanistan. We work more closely with India. We have to limit the amount of eggs, to use an overused metaphor, in Pakistan's basket, because we're going to be disappointed if we depend on them.
Mm-hmm. So as we look at this challenge, at the end of the day, this is about the national security of the United States, its citizens, to a large degree, as well as to, looking for stability in the region, and obviously in the case of Pakistan, a country with nuclear weapons, so that's another wrinkle to that dimension. I think our challenge is that Al-Qaeda isn't, fixed necessarily. How does the United States deal with that reality? How do we think about it as we're looking at the broader picture?
Well, you're exactly right, and here we are, we're coming up on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and one metaphor to think about is information technology. Things are getting diffused in this world, and that's what we're seeing also in terrorism. You're right, there's nothing special about the real estate in Afghanistan or Pakistan or anywhere else. Terrorists are just as happy to operate out of other countries or even out of cities in the United States or Europe. So what we've got to do is try to go after them when we find out about them using intelligence, law enforcement, military. We've got to protect ourselves, our borders, our country. We've got to build resilience into our society. That's where the whole homeland security thing goes in. And just as important, we've got to try to persuade young people not to become terrorists in the first place, or if they have made that career choice, we've got to try to work with them to walk that back. And that's again, it's an effort for hearts and minds. We have to get into schools. We've got to get into families. Remember, it was a year or so ago, that Nigerian father who turned in his son, the Christmas bomber, basically went to the American embassy and basically, there's something wrong with my son, I don't recognize him anymore. That's the sort of attitude we want to encourage. We want basically societies, we want parents, families, friends, neighbors to say this is not legitimate. This is inconsistent with, particularly in the Islamic world, this is inconsistent with Islam. This should not be tolerated. This should not be taught. This should not be in any way encouraged. And that's the sort of attitude we want. We need to find ways of reaching these young people, maybe using social media, using Twitter, using Facebook, which, by the way, are used by the terrorists to recruit and train. Why can't we take these technologies, which we in the West invented, and use them to reach these young people? It's something, for example, my organization, the Council on Foreign Relations, together with Google, we just had a conference with over 100 former violent people, gangs, terrorists, and the like. And the whole idea was to ask, how can we use modern technology to reach these largely young men, to get them to rethink what they're doing in their lives. So at the end of the day, we want to think about prevention just as much as we think about dealing with terrorists once they've already made that decision.
That's an interesting point, because one of the things that I've often said, I made a speech in Washington a couple of years ago about the Arab Street, and I said, if you don't listen to the Arab Street, we'll end up being, the victims of it, meaning that a younger population, more in poverty than not, looking at tomorrow and seeing no aspiration for the future, and having those who would pervert their thinking into acts of terrorism, and where dying is more glorifying than living. And so one of the changes that we've seen across the Arab world has been very interesting, that it's been focused not, for example, on the State of Israel and not on the United States or the West, but on its own leadership. And that is a moment, while perilous in some respects, could be a moment of opportunity as well.
And it's also interesting because not only is it not focused on Israel and not focused on the United States so far, it's also not been in any way stimulated by groups like Al-Qaeda. they've been marginalized. The people who are asking for a different political relationship between themselves and their governments, they want greater political participation, they want an end to what they see as their humiliation. It's interesting, groups like Al-Qaeda and the radicals have been largely missing from this debate, whether you call it the upheavals or the Arab Spring or what have you, and that's a good sign. It shows to me that these are still real marginal minorities. They've not captured the youth. They've not excited the youth of the Arab world. So I take that as a good sign. This is not hopeless, this battle particularly for young people, about what sort of relationship they ultimately have with societies and whether they become insiders or think they have no future except as violent outsiders. I don't think this is a struggle that in any way is hopeless. To the contrary, I think some of the recent developments, at least there, are positive.
How do we get our allies in the world more engaged, more committed to this cause? Because I'm not sure that the United States is overwhelmingly leading the way. The question is, they also have interests, national security interests, challenges. How do we get them? Are there countries that can help us influence, for example, Pakistan?
Pakistan is tough. I mean, the countries you can look to on the outside are, say, maybe China, Saudi Arabia, but the influence is going to be limited. That's almost always the case, that influence tends to be more limited than people want. Otherwise, more broadly, I think the outside world hasn't been bad on counterterrorism. They've been good about drying up flows of money to terrorists. They have been pretty good about sanctions against governments that support terrorism. I think where they sometimes part ways are over big operations like in Afghanistan, where they question whether it's worth it, or the debates say we're seeing somewhat in the Middle East. But by and large, I think there's a pretty good consensus in the world. And even the Russians, the Chinese, and others who have been victims themselves of terrorism. I think if you look at the last decade, the world's become a tougher place for terrorists to operate in. There's more intelligence sharing, there's more counterterrorism cooperation, more homeland security coordination, the fact that containers now get inspected overseas before they reach American ports in many cases, and so forth. I think there it's actually it's one of the few areas of the world over the last 10 years the good guys have gained ground. And I think, again, if you're a terrorist, you almost say your working environment has deteriorated. And that to me is one of the places we ought to feel good about when we look back.
Although it would seem that when we have to act upon that intelligence, that it's the U.S. seeming to be the entity that does it.
On a large scale, but other countries, the British are obviously willing to, and within their own territories, the Chinese, the Russians are not shy about going after what they would see as terrorists. Sometimes we may not agree exactly on who they are, which is another issue. But it is actually one of the issues when you look at the modern world. Say 2 decades after the end of the Cold War, a decade after 9/11, we actually say there's a degree of consensus. There's probably more consensus in this area about counterterrorism and more cooperation, as imperfect as it is. I'm not arguing your basic point. Than there tends to be in lots of other areas.
You had a foreign policy magic wand and could state, let's do A, B, and C in this part of the world. You'd say?
I would dramatically do less in Afghanistan, which I think could save on the order of $80 billion a year or more. I would have a conversation with the Pakistanis that essentially would link U.S. aid to very specific standards of behavior. I would get closer to India and bring in India and the surrounding countries, including Iran, by the way, into a dialogue about the future of Afghanistan, which I think there has to be a regional component. And I would do all of that in part because also I want to reorient U.S. foreign policy away from this part of the world. At the end of the day, I don't want this to be such a sponge for our economic, our military, and our diplomatic resources. I really do think there's other more important things we need to focus on.
Well, at $10 billion a month with a dramatically reduced Taliban with 50 to 100 al-Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan, I agree with you. It is time to move to a counterterrorism effort and to dramatically reduce our troops, bring them home, and preserve the national interests in a much more refined way. Dr. Haass, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you all for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you the next time as we report to the people.